Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. The concept of mindfulness is an ancient concept whose origin is likely largely unknown to many people alive today who are interested in a mindfulness practice of some kind. I've had some interesting conversations over the course of this show on mindfulness, notably with Deborah Eden Tull, Mark Coleman, and Ben Connolly, but until now I haven't really taken a historical dive into the origin of the term dating back to the life of the Buddha. So my guest on this episode is Dr. Sarah Shaw. Her new book, Mindfulness, Where It Comes From and What It Means, is out now from Shambhala Publications. It is a concise guide that unpacks the term mindfulness from its Buddhist beginnings to its present-day expressions in secular contexts. This book is an absolute delight, and I'm glad to take this historical journey as well as talk about relevant modern-day ideas and events back to the ancient heart of Buddhist practice. Dr. Sarah Shaw is a faculty member and lecturer at the University of Oxford who has published numerous books, articles, and essays on the history and practices of Buddhism. It is an absolute pleasure to chat about mindfulness with her on the show this week. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at classical_ideas. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation on the book Mindfulness, Where It Comes From and What It Means with Dr. Sarah Shaw. Dr. Sarah Shaw, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I'm very intrigued, and I'd like to find out more about how you present it.
Excellent. Well, it's a delight to have you. Can you just spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit? Because you have such a wide range of career experiences that I'm just curious how you would present your body of work.
Okay. Well, I did a doctorate in English literature, and I gave up academic work to have children. But all this time I was interested in Buddhism and practicing it and reading it and discussing it. And I had a very good teacher, Lance Cousins, who explained a lot about Buddhist principle to me. So when my children grew up a bit, I decided to change career tack, and we moved to Oxford. And I was very lucky that I was allowed to go to classes and lectures in Oxford in Pali and in Sanskrit. And eventually I was asked to write books and articles. And eventually I'm now teaching in the faculty at Oxford University and for the University of South Wales, where I teach an online MA. And all that time I've been a practitioner as well. So I practice Samatha breathing mindfulness with an association called the Samatha Trust, and I think in the States we're called the Samatha Foundation.
Excellent. Okay, so you teach in-person classes at Oxford. You're also a fellow at the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, and you teach in this online program as well. And I'm just curious about the two different teaching worlds that you're in. Can you tell me how you find teaching about Buddhism in person versus teaching about it online?
I think they're different skills and they have different pleasures. I really like the online teaching because it's a part-time MA at University of South Wales, and the people who do it are often practicing psychotherapists. They have clinical experience of working, say, with depressed people, or they're businessmen, or they're teachers, or their mums at home. They're older people, and they bring very interesting dimensions into their study of Buddhism. So it's a completely different sort of demographic, and it's international. Whereas obviously in Buddhist studies in Oxford, it's much more a younger kind of student, which is also wonderful in a different way. So they're just very, very different.
Do you have any challenges that you feel like you face as an instructor in the online platform? Because like right now, like things are going so much more online, and I'm curious do you feel like you're losing any of your ability to convey the lessons and teachings in the online platform versus in person, or do you feel like you're adjusting really well to this shift into the online world?
I think you have to be slightly informal in your interchanges, because you can't see the person, so you want them to feel relaxed, and that's very important, so that you could express things quite formally in a social context. And when you're emailing or on an online platform with somebody, writing something down, you don't know what they've been doing, and you want to make it friendly. So that's one very important aspect. The real challenge for me, though, is that I often teach people I'd just really like to meet, and I think, oh, isn't it a shame I'm not meeting this really interesting person? Particularly people, say, who are working in psychology, psychotherapy, or counselling, or have just got really interesting skills. There's one lady who was a tree specialist, and she was so good at analysing things, and that clearly her skills in tree analysis came in good stead when she was doing Buddhist philosophy. It was amazing, really.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, because some of my really good friends we just communicate only online now. So, and I also teach online, but I've also taught in person for a long time. And I was just curious how you were finding that as well. I found that to be a fascinating part of your teaching CV.
I'm doing both. I really do, because there is nothing that will ever be a substitute for meeting a person, and particularly a young student, that's really fun.
Nice.
But at the same time, I love the fact that if you teach an online MA, and the way we do it at our university is that we don't actually even have necessarily online Zoom or Skype contact. So it means that people in quite remote regions can do it, even if their internet connection isn't very good. So excellent. I like that too. They're different challenges.
Excellent. Well, and so you've been working and involved in Buddhism for a long time. I'm curious how you got interested and invested in the story of Buddhism, the history of Buddhism, and the practices of Buddhism. How did you come to dedicate your life to this?
Well, I certainly didn't sit down and think I'm going to dedicate my life to Buddhism. I think that would have appalled me. But a friend just invited me along to a meditation class when I was a student, and something intrigued me. I mean, this is the 70s, when people just didn't do meditation, as it wasn't normal. A lot of people didn't even particularly discuss it with their families or friends, because people would have thought it so odd. And something about the quality of stillness and the sense that the mind had all these possibilities. I remember somebody saying to me, in this class, you'll get a map for the mind. And I thought, gosh, that's amazing. And that still remains with me, the idea that you could have this very ancient path that would actually show you a map of the mind, and how to get to different states and things. Perhaps I just like maps, but it really intrigued me.
Has your path gone through various different Buddhist traditions? Have you tried different techniques throughout the years?
I have, but I've always stayed at the one that I was very lucky to find, Samatha Breathing Mindfulness. It was taught by somebody who was lecturing in Buddhism at the University of Manchester, L.S. Cousins. I was just very lucky to find a tradition that just completely suited me. And the people in my class, I still know them, they're still in the same tradition too. Having said that, I've quite often over the years either been in, say, teaching summer schools in Zen traditions, or gone to Tibetan ceremonies, or been involved a little bit in Tibetan practices. And I'm very interested in Western mysticism as well. I'm interested in things like Kabbalah and Gurdjieff, and so I find all these things enrich a path. But I think you do have to have an allegiance. Well, I certainly do. I feel I have to remain true to something, and maybe have a look at other things, but remain true to one tradition. But I certainly don't regard that tradition as being monolithic and excluding, say, other Buddhist traditions. I think Buddhism has always been much more porous than that and much more permeable, really. That I don't see, but I do think you have to, for me anyway, it was very important to stay true to one practice and one school.
I'm absolutely delighted that you brought up Gurdjieff, because you have a new book out on Shambhala, and there's an author for Shambhala named Dr. Roger Lipsey, who wrote an amazing book called Gurdjieff Reconsidered, or is it Revisited? Forgetting off the top of my head. But yeah, I love that you mentioned Gurdjieff, because that's such an discussed figure. So speaking of your new book, you have a brand new book, Mindfulness, where it comes from and what it means, from Shambhala. And as you were writing the book, I was taken by the story of you being at this meditation retreat and casually talking to folks about what mindfulness meant to them. And mindfulness is this concept that has gotten so much attention in recent years. But I'm curious what the people who you were talking to at the meditation retreat, what the concept of mindfulness meant to them. What did you find out in those conversations?
Well, we'd had a 2-week retreat together, and obviously we hadn't been talking very much. And I hadn't been even thinking about the book, or I'd been on a meditation course. But towards the end, it was on the last couple of days, I thought, I'm sitting on a table here with all these people who've been practicing mindfulness. Why don't I pick their brains, which I'm always happy to do. And I just went round the table, and in fact, I recorded it in the book exactly as it happened, pretty well verbatim. And people and I said, how would you describe mindfulness? What is it? And they all came up with different, like one came up with a story, one had a really interesting image, different definitions. And I just found it really helpful, because they'd obviously been practicing it for a couple of weeks and we hadn't been talking much during that time. And it was just interesting to see how they did describe it when they got round to it. And there was some really good descriptions there, I thought.
And I was looking up the book as well, and I noticed that you performed the audiobook as well, correct? Can you tell me a little bit about that process of committing your book to the audio version as well?
It's difficult. I thought, that's easy. I'll just have to read it out. But it isn't as easy as it sounds, because like we're talking now and I can say what I want to.
Right.
But if you're doing an audiobook, you can't. And you get told off if you put a the instead of a they or something.
Right.
They actually, and they're really scrupulous about it. It's a wonderful professional skill, and I was very impressed with the people who recorded it, because they really wanted you to have every word right. And if you faltered or stumbled, as we usually do in speech, like I just said,
yeah,
nobody minds, because that's what you expect. You can't do that on an audiobook. So it was great fun, but hard work.
One of the things that I struggle with whenever I'm reading is, like, I write introductions for this podcast, and whenever I'm reading them, sometimes I find myself getting anxious and out of breath while I'm trying to perform something perfectly that I've written. Did you struggle with that at all in the recording studio?
Well, I thought if I'm talking about a book about mindfulness, I ought really to try and do it a bit. So I did some breathing. I tried to be aware of the breath while I was doing it. And contact with the seat. That's really helpful. If you're actually aware of where you're sitting and your contact with the ground, it just makes something easier. Posture.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, so the concept of mindfulness is something that I've featured it on the show a few times, and it's people believe that they understand what the term means. It's oftentimes presented as like secularly accepted in many ways, especially like in the corporate world. But I think that what people are missing is the backstory of the ancient origin of the term. Is there like a little bit of a backstory about the ancient origin of the term that you can tell in order to put that a little more into the conversation?
Well, I think the first thing I really must say is that I would always be mildly suspicious if I met somebody who was very confident about what mindfulness was.
Good.
I've had obviously I spoke to a lot of people and considered it myself, and I noticed that the more experienced a meditator was, the more Buddhist practice that they'd done, the less willing were they to fix upon a definition. They saw the implications, and they were really careful. Whereas if you talk to somebody maybe who's done a mindfulness course somewhere, they'd be quite confident, and they should be, because they've learned something that's given them a lot of hope and confidence. And so it's right, they are like that. But I noticed that the very experienced people were more cautious. So I really want to say that.
Mm.
As regards the backstory, it is a very ancient word, smrti, and it usually means memory in Sanskrit, and continues to after the time of the Buddha. It still usually means memory, except obviously in Buddhist Sanskrit texts. It has a particular association with, I think, a sense of tradition. And there's a very good scholar on ancient India, Patrick Olivelle, and he suggests the word tradition for its early form as being the most inclusive of all its references, because people used to chant texts. This is pre-reading, and so mindfulness, or smrti, usually meant at that time the memory, and often the memory that was required to recite texts to a group of people, because the text was only existed really when it was chanted, if you see what I mean. There wasn't a book you could pick up. So it was very important, it was very embodied, and they used pitch gestures. They moved their hands while they're chanting. So it's a really physical activity. Now, there are one or two places in very early texts, I understand, I don't read Vedic, where it's starting to have a little bit of a shade towards adverting to the present, and sometimes in quite a positive way, and you do get little hints of that in very early Indic literature before the Buddha, and a little bit of a sense of noting. But by and large, it usually just means memory or tradition. I think tradition's a very good translation. The Buddha clearly changed this word and used it, as he often did with Brahminic terms. He'd kind of take a familiar term and just change its meaning slightly. And we assume this is what he did. I'm not saying this with anybody who can say with confidence what happens is clearly is not really speaking from a position of authority, because we don't know. But it looks like the Buddha just changed the meaning of the word to mean a kind of positive adverting to the present, an attentiveness to the present, which wasn't just a passive awareness. You could actually advert your mind to things which would be restorative or helpful. So that's rather a long explanation. I tend to avoid definitions, but that really, it's an attentiveness to the present, which it can be active. You can advert to certain objects if you wish to.
You mentioned the Sanskrit term smrti. So the Buddha spoke Pali, correct?
No, actually, there is some. Richard Gombrich has recently argued that he probably could have spoken Pali. The usual scholarly assumption is that he spoke an early Indo, a Middle Indo-Aryan dialect, something like Pali.
Okay.
It would be a language that was very like Pali. Yeah.
Did the term change from the Sanskrit whenever the Buddha, changed the term? Like, did it become something new, like a new term?
In effect, yes. The word to remember in Sanskrit is much the same in Pali. So it also retained the sense of memory. So if you were in a Pali text and somebody was remembering something, they would use that verb to remember. Sati, they'd be remembering, and it would be the same verb. So it includes the past as well. And I think that is interesting, because there's a sense that if you're mindful, you are aware of things that may include the past. And so it's quite, I think the English word mindfulness is actually a very good translation of sati. Because we tend to have that, if you're mindful of things in the past, you can be mindful of things. And we also have that suggestion that you can actually be almost ethically aware of something. Mindfulness has that feeling of, traditionally, I'm mindful of my friends, or if you look at earlier usages of the word mindfulness, it suggests a kind of care.
Interesting. And now I'm wondering, like, if the term for sati or smriti in other languages and the translation is as well done as mindfulness in English. Like, I wonder if the translation in like Norwegian is equally appropriate, or in Japanese is appropriate. You know, I'm wondering if that term comes across as well in translation in other languages as it does in English. That's so funny.
So do I, and I don't know, but I don't speak Chinese. But somebody told me that the Chinese, the Nyan, which I'm probably pronouncing completely wrongly, actually means recitation as well. And of course that fits in with so many Chinese mindfulness practices, which are to do with recitation of mantras, or the for remembering the name of the Amitabha, and that the word mindfulness is actually a very similar sort of term as recitation. Which came first, I don't know, and I don't speak Chinese, so I'm not qualified to talk about that.
So mindfulness today is often sort of described as like living in the moment, and other little catchphrases that like can like almost like fit on like internet memes and things like that. How is the depiction of living in the moment, is this limiting in understanding the actual concept?
I don't like to see it that way. I think if it helps people, then that's very good. Most of us do need to live in the moment more. So I think it's just very good, but maybe that involves quite a lot of other things that aren't covered by that term. But I wouldn't criticize it as a meme if it works. It's
Excellent.
Fine. Yeah.
And so like this is like one small piece. Mindfulness is like one small piece of a much larger set of teachings within Buddhism. And I'm curious if you can describe what people might recognize between like ancient mindfulness and mindfulness of today. Like, are we still if somebody has like a mindfulness practice today, are they doing things that people did centuries ago, or has it like changed a lot over the years?
Well, if they're doing mindfulness of breathing, you read a text from a very early period and you recognize what they're doing and what they describe. That's much the same. And I'm sure human minds are much the same. So they're probably dealing with the same sort of problems. I suspect we probably need something different now. And there's an interesting example of this. The thing I don't find in very early texts is advice about posture. How to hold your body, say, when you're meditating. You know, what to do with your legs and things like that. There's very little. They just say back straight, sitting cross-legged or something. Now, any modern book on meditation and mindfulness would actually put quite a lot of work into explaining posture, because we don't sit on the ground all the time. And I think at a very base level, literally, we're probably not as mindful of our bodies as people would probably. This is completely conjecture on my part. I think they didn't really have seats in ancient India. They'd just be sitting on the floor. It wouldn't occur to them to have a problem with their posture, because they're always sitting on the floor or the ground.
Yeah,
this is completely my own surmise. It's something I think about sometimes, because you don't find much about posture in the very early texts. apart from yoga sutras, but there isn't much about just, oh, I get knee ache, what should I do, which you'd find in any modern manual.
That's so interesting because I'm sitting on my sofa right now and I'm sort of
Mm,
lounged backwards, but
mm,
I've been sitting on sofas like this my entire life. And
mm,
so I'm very, very used to this position that I'm in. But if I had grown up without like these pieces of large, bulky furniture within my, my sitting areas in my homes over the years, I would imagine that my physiological awareness of my body would be so much different because I would be adjusting in ways that would accommodate
mm,
for comfort on hard surfaces.
mm. I remember visiting France years ago, a little village, years and years ago, and everybody spent the whole evening sitting in high-backed chairs quite comfortably all evening.
Hmm.
Uh, so they all had beautiful carriage and wonderful, graceful posture. Um, so I think our bodies are slightly different in that regard. So perhaps we need some different applications to arouse mindfulness, and perhaps they needed to do other things in ancient times. But by and large, the instructions for things like breathing mindfulness, being aware of the outside, the inside, both inside and outside, these are the same experience now as they were then, really.
Which is really, you know, amazing and romantic in a way to think about the connections that we have and the commonalities that we have to people that are so many centuries in our past, that we would have the same kinds of struggles and the same types of stresses and the same things that we were worried about, and how there are things that we can do now that they would do then in order to bring comfort in their day-to-day lives. I really like that connection to our
Mm, mm,
to our ancestors from centuries past.
mm,
It's really
mm.
beautiful to
We,
consider.
well, they breathed too, and they
Yeah.
needed to be mindful, and they got distracted, and they probably daydreamed during a boring talk, or I'm sure the mind is much the same. Yeah.
Well, something that I really like about your book is how it discusses varying locations. Like you have individual chapters on like Tibet and China and around East Asia. And in your preface of the book, you write that there are, quote, comprehensive step by step how to advice on how to find mindfulness.
Mm,
So
mm,
some places some place states of mindfulness within like a full graduated meditative system. Some give
mm,
guidelines about its presence for times of deep meditation. Some list qualities needed for meditation that require
mm.
mindfulness, giving like varying degrees of priority according to the needs at which that list is addressed. Um, what can you tell me about how different places around the world where Buddhism is prevalent prioritize a mindfulness practice as like a major part of being Buddhist? Like we think about Buddhism and mindfulness, um, as being very intertwined, but I'm curious if different countries in the world who are majority Buddhist or have a large Buddhist population, if they actually prioritize mindfulness in the way that's currently being discussed in the West, for example.
I think most Buddhists would see the Eightfold Path and right mindfulness is one of eight as all being important. And I think that would be true of most forms of Buddhism. Um, what intrigues me is that a lot of Buddhisms have developed in a way their own way of arousing mindfulness. And this is something, again, which I didn't feel expert on, but I asked a lot of people about. For instance, in Japan, you have these wonderful dos, and the various arts where people in some way enact a principle that animates the mindful mind through, say, calligraphy or flower arranging, and obviously there's a whole doctrinal understanding behind those activities. But it's as if that to do it the way it needs to be done, you have to be mindful. So
Hmm.
it's almost like mindfulness might not even be mentioned, but in order to be able to do it properly, you need to become mindful. And I find that very beautiful when something is so deeply assimilated into a society and a religious tradition that they look for expressions of it that don't even need to use the word mindfulness because it is aroused by the very activity itself. And where I love it particularly is actually, I remember once watching a program about Zen monks who had to do housework very, very quickly as part of their monastic day, just very, very quickly.
Yeah, and like they push the rags on the floors and everything. It's amazing.
It's wonderful, and it was so exhilarating to watch. And I realized they were actually making it into a mindfulness exercise. So it was both very vigorous, very mindful, and actually got the place clean too, which is good. So it had this wonderful fusion of roles into very simple activities. And I like that. And that's what I was really interested in, because I think the scholarly books on subjects tend to think that the history of the world is a change of ideas all the time, when I feel that the history of the world is really about people and what they're doing and how they're talking, how they're behaving to one another. And if one can get a glimpse of how the ancients must have behaved, and of things that people do that embody something rather than necessarily talk about it, I find that really interesting. We can't know, but it's just interesting to feel the presence of something ancient in something somebody's doing now.
I love the example of the Zen monks vigorously cleaning, because in my classroom, one time I actually showed clips exactly like that, and the 18-year-old high school students that I was teaching, a few of them said, "Can we try that?" And so I went and got a bunch of wash rags, and we ran up and down the hallways, buffing the floor with our rags like they were doing on the video. And they got a great kick out of it. Like, we put a sort of like a hands-on activity for in connection to what we were seeing on the screen, so that students could see what the body felt like doing those actions. And it was a great fun.
And the key word there is fun too.
Absolutely.
And that sense of being alert to they would be really mindful. Now, I'm sure you didn't even talk about mindfulness, but it would have been aroused to some degree in what they were doing anyway. And I find that interesting.
Absolutely, because like, you push it and it's hard work, and you don't want to fall over, and you don't want to like smash your face into the floor while you're doing it. So there is this massive element of concentration, of being right there in that moment and doing that. It's just a memory that jumps out to me from my classroom that I just had to have a laugh about just for a second. Okay, so you have some concepts in your book and some terms that are completely brand new to me. And a few of these concepts are Abhidharma. Did I say that properly?
Yes, yeah.
And then the other one, another one that jumps out at me was Madhyamaka. Is that it? Madhyamaka. I love it.
Yeah, nice word, isn't it? Yes, Madhyamaka.
I love it. I'm curious about these systems, how they're complementary. I've never heard of them. Can you tell us a little bit about those concepts?
Well, Abhidharma, I love Abhidharma. I should also add here that a lot of scholars don't. They think it's very boring, or too scholastic, or too something or other. I've always really liked it. It's really the early Buddhist system of psychology. It describes, in a phenomenological way, I suppose, what it is like, what is going on in the mind when you are in a good state, and what is going on in the mind when you're in a bad state. And so there's one book, the Dhammasangani, which is a classic book of early Abhidhamma. It's two M's in Pali and an R and an M in Sanskrit. There's a very early book, and it just describes all the qualities present when the mind is mindful and healthy. And I actually once taught Abhidhamma, or I do it every year to adults. And instead of giving them this list, I actually asked them around the class to tell me what qualities they felt were present whenever there was a mindful and healthy state in their mind. And the amazing thing was, we wrote them all up on the whiteboard, and then I read them the Abhidhamma list. And in nearly all cases, they were in both lists. But if you ask somebody what's present when the mind is alert and in a good state, you'll come up with a list just like the Abhidhamma. And that's wonderful, really, to think that this was formulated sort of 2,000 years ago, and a modern interested audience would still find the same factors there. So that's Abhidharma. It's what's going on in the mind at any moment, and it's really an early system of psychology, very popular in Southeast Asia and Asia. And Madhyamaka is being in the middle. Madhya is the middle, and it's the philosophy of being in the middle, and it's really a kind of, I always think of it as aerobics for the mind. It's a very challenging system of philosophy, which is intended to break down our assumptions, to arouse, if you like, mindfulness of our minds and how they work. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, another part of the book that I really enjoy is your discussion of the subtle variations between Mahayana and Theravada traditions with regards to mindfulness. What are a few of your favorite subtle differences?
Let's think. I liked there's a Mahayana formulation about being mindfulness of everybody around you being a bodhisattva, potential Buddha or bodhisattva. And I like that, because it means that everybody that you encounter, it kind of reminds you that they could actually be on a path. They could be a bodhisattva, and that this could be a very important interchange for them. Just one meeting or somebody on a bus, and I like that. And they call that a mindfulness, and I thought that was a very interesting development.
Lovely. Well, you also said something, another thing in the book that really jumped out at me. So I often talk about why I do this show. And the reason I do it is because I just simply have devoted my life to trying to learn something new every day. Just like staying curious, I feel like is the number one health benefit that I have for myself as a human being. And you have a quote in the book that says that mindfulness, quote, this is you now, leads directly to investigation. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that, because it just resonates with everything that I try to do with this show for sure. Totally.
Yes, it's interesting, that, isn't it? And there's a little list in Buddhism called the 7 Factors of Awakening, and they're the 7 factors that really characterize an awake and healthy mind. And the first one is mindfulness, and the suttas say it leads naturally to investigation, Dhammavichaya. And in fact, in practice, you always have to test these things in practice. Does it? And I think it does. And what it is one investigates is very important. If I've got a grudge against somebody, if I investigate all the reasons why I'm annoyed with them, I'm going to get in a very bad mood. But if I investigate my knitting or something that I find interesting, or painting or something like that, then I tend to get in quite a good mood, because I find it quite interesting. So mindfulness, if you like, establishes a field which you can use in a useful way. And I think your instincts are entirely right to keep the mind curious. They're always telling us that that's one of the things that actually, from the scientific point of view, does keep the mind healthy, that kind of curiosity. And you see children playing with new toys. It's like they do it 3-dimensionally. They're kind of really engaged in a certain way. And I think that's Dhammavichaya in a sort of latent sense. Investigation.
What so we were talking earlier before we were recording a little bit about animals, and I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what you've noticed as far as mindfulness within your observations of animals in your life.
Well, it's something that interests me, because while I was writing this book, I was looking at all this philosophy about, it was talking about the states of mind of animals, the Abhidhamma does. So I'd kind of take my dog for a walk, and I think, I wonder if my dog's mindful. And I would notice, and there was one day in particular, I took Humphrey for a walk. He's a Springer Spaniel, so he's usually very lively, but he was very quiet this day and he just looked so beautifully serene. And I thought, oh my goodness, I wonder, is Humphrey mindful? And I thought, well, perhaps he is for a moment. And then he saw something he wanted to kill, and he was in there killing it with a little bird. And I thought, well, we mustn't sentimentalize the mental states of animals. But according to Buddhist theory, they have to have a chance to exercise mindfulness. Otherwise, they'd be stuck in that particular rebirth forever. And if they can have just a few moments of mindfulness, that's their chance of a better rebirth. Animals like chanting, and they like being near people meditating. I've noticed that with my cat as well. They'll tend to just sit very quietly because they are very sensitive, and we could perhaps assume that they have some seeds of mindfulness there.
So not only are you a scholar of the history of Buddhism and it within your academic work, but you also are a practitioner. Do you have any specific goals that you still hope to achieve within your practice?
Gosh, I've never been asked that question. It's a very interesting one.
Sometimes there is no goal.
Well, that's the kind of pat answer one could easily give and say, oh, well, there are no goals in Buddhist practice. And I think for some people there are and need to be. I think certainly if you do a samatha practice, to have some goals is not a bad thing. I think my goal is just to keep doing it, really. And hope I continue to enjoy it. Yeah, that's a hope rather than a goal.
Well, so. Dr. Sarah Shaw, I am absolutely loving your new book, Mindfulness: Where It Comes From, What It Means. It can be found from Shambhala. Do you have any places where people could find any of your other work that you may recommend, like your center or anything like that, if they wanted to know more about your career?
Well, if you're interested if people are interested in meditation and practicing breathing mindfulness, we have a website, samatha.org, where we upload we've been doing a newsletter over lockdown. We've had lockdown here in the UK, and we have articles and videos. And obviously, if people would like to look at that and find out more from that, they're most welcome to. And I write books. Most of them are on Amazon. And I've done one or two podcasts talking about early Buddhist stories and texts for Wise Studies. Wise Studies is the company that did those. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I will also put links in the show notes for listeners to the websites that you just mentioned, so people will be able to just go underneath your episode within their podcast app and click on those links if you want to know more. Dr. Sarah Shaw, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with me today about your work, your brand new book, and your practice. I really appreciate your time and having you on the show.
Well, thank you, Greg, and thank you for asking such interesting questions and for having a show like this. Well done. Thank you very much.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.